Welcome everyone to our first public lecture. Today, Dr. GM Wali Ullah will give us his highly anticipated talk, How to Prepare for a PhD Degree in Business, the Long Game. Dr. Wali Ullah is an acclaimed academic with over a decade of experience and is currently a lecturer at Flinders University in Australia. I'm sure everyone is eagerly waiting for his talk. So, without any further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. GM Wali Ullah. Dr. Wali Ullah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diaj. Thank you very much for having me here today for this opportunity to present what I feel would be a very time-relevant topic in terms of preparing for a PhD degree in business as a discipline. And you'd notice that, obviously, as the title suggests, it's about how to prepare for a PhD degree in business, the long game. As I am a lecturer in finance, obviously, when it comes to the long game, it actually has quite a bit of meaning. The long game in finance essentially means that whenever you are, let's say, investing money in anywhere, in the stock markets, in the assets, real estate, you generally think from a very long time perspective, 2 years, 3 years, rather than just trying to make a quick profit at the very instant. Because in terms of investments, quick returns are not always something that's sustainable and something that's actually worth replicating for. But when it comes to planning for a long term ahead, that's essentially where investments pay off. And from the perspective of having a PhD degree in business, this is something relevant to that. It's a long game in terms of planning and doing a lot of things to prepare yourself to be a worthy candidate that would get a PhD admission at reputed universities, particularly within the business sector. Because as a whole, and I believe all of you would notice, is that when it comes to PhD degrees or in general doctorate research degrees, the STEM sector is where it's more relevant. Business is in many cases, in many ways, sort of like something that's not as much focused as any other discipline. So obviously this is where a lot of planning comes in, and that's the whole reason behind the title of my presentation today, in terms of taking the long game to get a successful admission in a PhD degree in business. Now, before I proceed further, I'd like to essentially establish myself a little bit in terms of why I'm having this talk and why I'm somebody who's qualified enough to talk about this. So on that aspect, I am Wali, as Dr. Diaj has introduced. I hold a PhD degree in corporate finance from the University of Adelaide. I've completed my PhD degree with the Adelaide International Scholarship in 2022, and I was the mess bearer for my graduating class for academic achievements. Prior to that, I worked for 4.5 years in Bangladesh at Independent University. And before that, obviously, I did my master's and bachelor's, master's in international finance at the University of Westminster, UK, with a full tuition scholarship, and a BBA in finance from East West University, where I graduated summa cum laude. In terms of work experience, coming to Australia, I worked at a number of places, holding teaching positions at University of Adelaide, UniS Online, and Australian Institute of Business, before joining Flinders University as a full-time lecturer. In terms of my effort with the long game, I was rewarded, obviously, with PhD scholarships. I decided to pursue the one at University of Adelaide, but obviously, apart from that, I also tried in a number of places, and I was also successful in receiving another PhD scholarship from Victoria University of Wellington. And in terms of being an academic, in a sense where we have not just teaching responsibilities, but also research, publications, and grants, and all these things, which are essentially a product of the PhD training that we receive. I have had around 8 publications in Scopus Q1 and Q2 ranked journals, along with a number of others in Q2 and Q3 as well. Now, in terms of the fact that we are talking about PhD degree in business, my focus here is going to be more in terms of the program structure and all this training and preparations for pursuing doctoral research in Australia, UK, and New Zealand, because these are some of the places where there is a bit of similarities. North American degrees are a bit different to some extent with regards to getting admission. So some of the commonalities will also be there, but My talk is more focused on Australia, UK, and New Zealand, because these are the three markets where I have tried and studied, got scholarships, and that's where my expertise is. Now, one thing to always notice is the fact that with regards to doctoral research, even though I'm highlighting PhD, but also Masters in Research or MPhil, these are research-focused programs. So these are not like the regular teaching coursework programs that we do with bachelor's or teaching like coursework master's program, MScs or MBAs. On those programs, it's more about completing courses, getting a good grade, finishing the program with a good CGPA. Doctoral research, MRes, MPhil, PhD, these are more research focused. These are not where you get CGPA's grades and then based on that you determine how good you have done, but rather it's a bit more in terms of training to be an independent researcher with the end goal that you'll be able to write a full-length PhD thesis. In terms of the thesis size, there is no set word limit. Even though in the past it used to be like 100,000 words and so on, but it totally depends on the area of your research. I know a lot of people who does PhD in economic theory, having a thesis that's less than 100 pages, whereas many who does PhD in management and a lot of other areas where there are a lot of semi-structured interviews, questionnaires, and a lot of other qualitative, in many cases, qualitative research areas, where it can go up to 400, 500 pages. In my own case, my thesis was around 230 pages. So it's not necessarily the fact that the word count matters, but the main outcome usually is to either have a thesis with a full thesis structure or one where it's essentially considered a thesis by publication, where you essentially look at 3 full-length journal articles. In many cases, it could be more, it could be less, it could be where it's more conference papers, but the idea is that it's supposed to have 3 major chapters, which are essentially 3 full-length journal articles having the same broader theme. And this is where you essentially end up with at the end of your PhD research program. Now, even though I'm saying that this is not like regular teaching coursework program, a lot of good quality PhD programs have PhD level coursework. A lot of the research intensive universities, for example, in Australia with a group of 8 universities, or with the UK, the Russell Group universities, they have PhD level courseworks with the program. So this is where these are research courses. This is where you get a lot of understanding in terms of the theory behind the major subject area, as well as a lot of times training with qualitative or quantitative research, econometric modeling, all these things. So most of the cases, like in some of the universities, they might have like a typical grading structure with those coursework. In some cases, it's mostly just a pass or fail to show that the candidate has passed through all this required coursework. So for example, again, and in these sort of cases, I'll try to come up with my own example, because this is where I know where things happen and how things turned out. At the University of Adelaide, when I was going through my PhD, I had to go through 6 courseworks, 5 internal. Those were mostly related to econometrics, related to finance theory, corporate finance theory as a whole. And also I had to do 1 external coursework with FERN, which is a research organization with major Australian universities as a key research partner. And the coursework I did with that was about behavioral finance with Monash University. So essentially these are, again, as I said, courseworks where it was more about passing or failing. And this is more in line with the North American PhD structure, where they have courseworks for the first 2 years for the most part. And once you pass through that with comprehensive exams, then you move to the research phase for 3 years. Here, given the degree structure and the legislatures, particularly in Australia, it's mostly a 3-year program, sometimes 4 years. And the courses are essentially attached in the first year, or it could be spread across all over the 3 years, 3.5 years program. Even though it's mostly seen at the top universities now, a lot of other universities are coming up with their own coursework. However, the research structure in Australia is more about those big universities getting the funds, obviously getting things done with that. So obviously what happens is a lot of smaller universities, they don't have enough students to run those courses. But in those cases, what might happen is that based on funding's availability, sometimes students are asked to audit research level courses in other universities or programs, such as the foreign PhD courses. This is mostly again applicable for Australia, but in many cases, given the geographic location with New Zealand, the close proximity of it, I mean, students pursuing PhD in New Zealand also has a lot of these things in commonality, as well as being able to do or audit research courses, programs with Australian programs. There are also AFANs, which is related to accounting and finance as well, and they do certain courses or training programs and conferences as well. Now, given the fact that this whole degree program structure is research, this is where you have supervisors. These are the most key personnel one could ever have, because these are the resources. I would not say supervisors are just people. They are the resources that will help you navigate through the whole program. So generally, the typical structure would be a supervisory panel consisting of a principal supervisor, and then there might be 2, 3, or 4 co-supervisors, associate supervisors, or adjunct supervisors from other universities. But it's essentially the principal supervisor who holds the most weight of the workload associated with the research training provided to the PhD candidate. This is where personality communication is so much important, because essentially to navigate through the PhD program, you need to have a very good conversation, good connection with the principal supervisor. Both of you need to be in line with what is required, which direction the research is going to go through. General Australian guidelines says that at the initial stages, there should be regular meetings, at least fortnightly, if not weekly. This is where you would come up with ways to demonstrate what you're trying to do with your research projects, what are your plans, how you're planning to publish, how you're planning to write papers, how you're planning to do analytical analysis, all these things. And this is where the supervisors are supposed to guide the student. Now, even though there are various interpretations of that in terms of how or why or in which ways the supervisors can guide the students, but generally what happens is it's not like where the supervisors are going to be writing any part of the thesis directly. That's not their job at all, but rather it's more about providing this sort of comprehensive understanding through a lot of comments, criticisms in terms of the PhD students' writing, how they're writing as a whole, how are they framing the question, whether it is making sense, whether it is actually adding anything, any contribution to the literature, and in many cases challenging the results, critiquing whatever they're doing. Because at the end of the day, even though a lot of people have the general idea that, okay, the principal supervisor or the PhD supervisors are just critiquing without any sort of reasoning, whenever at the end of the day, a PhD student is going to submit their chapters to different journals for publication, that will go through external peer review. And those are blinded peer review, so we don't know who is reviewing your paper. And they will always be attacking a paper as if there is a barrier to cross, so that they know, after facing any sort of criticism possible, the paper that is being reviewed and revised and resubmitted is at a quality that's required to uphold the academic and research integrity. So the supervisors act as, at the end of the day, internal reviewers. So when a supervisor is providing critique, this is something you would face whenever you submit your paper to an external journal, but rather it's coming internally, so you know how to make it better without getting rejected. So that's one of the major reasons, which is why we have PhD supervisors. And this is essentially very important to improve the quality of the research outcome. And with regards to the program, once it starts, once you have a supervisor, a set of supervisory panel agreeing to supervise you, you come, you start your PhD, the initial hurdle you'd face is through the proposal defense. This is usually done within the first 6 to 12 months, depending on the different university programs. This is where the student has to defend the general proposal of his or her PhD research to show that whatever that person is planning to do is actually worth pursuing. So this is where the initial research proposal that is written, which I will come in to discuss a bit more, is essentially evaluated through external reviewers or in many cases internal reviewers. And it needs to demonstrate the fact that this is a research project which is feasible, that is something that can be done, and that is unique and at the end of the day adding value to the literature. Many consider this proposal defense to be just as a show to see that, okay, it's going through all the proper phases, but it's not something you can expect as an automatic pass. Even though there are, for the majority of the part, people go through the proposal defense without much issues, there is a history of students failing, which might lead to downgrading your PhD studies into MPhil or Masters by Research, which is essentially where you fail to get into the PhD program, because this initial hurdle is essentially telling you that you passed the general candidature, you are a PhD candidate, and you can move forward. So this is where the initial proposal is supposed to be strengthened and potentially lead up to that 3-paper structure with a core broad theme or construct. But then again, it could be in different structures. I'm telling it from the perspective that most finance PhD programs that I've seen, they go through this sort of structure. And obviously, this is where a bit more extensive literature review would be needed to ensure that the research gap that you've identified is actually making sense. You'd be identifying the proper research model and data sources, which you might not have had enough idea about before pursuing your degree. And if possible, trying to run some baseline analysis to validate the fact that this research actually merits continuing because the initial results are all there. So this is generally how the whole program structure would start. Now, before getting into that, you need to obviously pass the initial hurdle, that is going through the admissions eligibility criteria. As I said, because this is not a coursework degree, the eligibility criteria for admission is quite different. Ideally, in Australia, New Zealand, and in many cases UK as well, they would require you to hold a research master's program. That would mean either a master's by research, MRes, or an MPhil. Or in many cases, and most of the times nowadays, it's fine to go through with that with a coursework master's degree, but it must have a significant research component, which is usually a thesis. Ideally, this research component should account for at least 25% of the total credit point of that degree. So for example, if you're doing a master's coursework, but it has, let's say, 180 credits, you are doing a thesis, like that program has a thesis that has, let's say, 60 credits out of 180. So it has to be, as I said, 25% or above. So when you consider the fact that, okay, you have this program where it's 60 credits out of 180 total credits, that's 33.3%. That would mean that, okay, your master's is sufficient to go through with the initial admission criteria because the research component of thesis is more than 25% of the credits. So this is a very initial requirement. There are possibilities where exceptions can be made for significant publication history, which is something I actually had received because my master's back in 2012, back at that time, this research component thesis part wasn't that big of a deal. So when I passed my master's, it was with good results and I did have a thesis, but the credit points were not aligned in that way. So when I was starting to apply in Australian universities, a lot of universities, particularly the smaller ones, they were not making me eligible because it's not meeting that criteria. But then again, exceptions were made as it can be, depending on significant publication history, which I had prior to my admission with PhD admission process. So that's the rare cases, but these days now it's quite like standard. Since 2015, pretty much all the coursework master's program in UK and typically have research component exceeding 25%. Same pretty much with a lot of universities in Malaysia and a lot of other countries. However, in Australia, for example, when you do a coursework master's, most of the time they don't have any thesis. So that would mean you would not be eligible for that. So if you are someone who is playing this long game of PhD admission by planning to go for a master's overseas, ensure that you're doing a coursework master's with the research component meeting this criteria. A lot of universities don't in Australia. Most of the master's courses, they don't have a thesis, which means it's not fulfilling this criteria. So if you do that, you will not be eligible to apply for PhD straight away. Maybe they will let you need to do another master's in research, which in most cases might not be feasible given the amount of tuition fees you have to pay. So this is a very important fact to look out for. And obviously, at the end of the day, PhD is something that is pursued by students who are academically talented. And one of the basic criteria for the selection panel to overview is to look at the CGPA. So essentially, even if you have an undergraduate degree from whichever university you are doing, ensure that the CGPA is at the top 5%. That's essentially a very good cutoff point. In terms of publication, given the fact that it's so competitive, most of the universities, particularly the smaller ones where there is a lack of funding, you will see that STEM science sector, they have more scholarships available compared to business. In many cases, they might have 2 or 3 scholarships for business students compared to 20 or 30 for science in many cases. So to cut through that competition, one fact that makes up for a good sort of eligibility criteria fulfillment is having a good publication record, because that carries a lot of points in the whole admission process. Typically, a good publication record of at least 2 or 3 Scopus or ABDC index article is a good way to proceed, which again begs the question that this is a long game. You need to plan ahead and there is a long process to go with. You also need to convince prospective supervisors who has agreed to supervise you based on a solid research proposal. Even though some universities, they don't allow or they don't require an applicant to contact a supervisor straight away. Rather, once the criteria is met, they will assign supervisors for universities like, in many cases, Monash or UNSW. But most of the universities would require a supervisor to be agreed to supervise, to proceed. And as I will discuss soon on how to convince supervisors, a solid research proposal is required. Many consider teaching experience to be a mandatory fact. It's not. It's good if you have it, particularly when you start with your PhD, and if usually at the second year level, PhD students are provided with teaching opportunities or teaching assistant opportunities in most universities. But it's not a mandatory thing. It's mostly the 3 above criteria that's more important. Now, first of all, how to approach potential supervisors. Obviously, you need to directly email them. Unless you have the opportunity to come here in Australia, UK, and meet with the supervisor directly, which is highly unlikely for most of the people, email is the way to go. And some might say that, okay, I've emailed a lot of supervisors, they don't respond, they don't read the emails. It's highly unlikely because I myself is a registered supervisor at Flinders University. We do read the emails. And this is where a lot of students fail to get the traction required to convince the supervisors, because this is one where you will showcase your selling points to make sure the supervisor is interested. So this is a template that I used for my own PhD admission process. As you can see, this is a very initial one where you first start with the very basic idea of what you're asking for from the supervisor. You have to ensure that you maintain what your research focus area interest is. And that is important because at the end of the day, it has to be aligned with the supervisor. And this is where a lot of mistakes are made, where let's say an accounting interested student approaches a management or economics professor asking for their assistance, which might not make sense. This is where you have to ensure that obviously your research focus is aligned with the supervisor's interested area. This is where also you would highlight what you have in terms of your publications, teaching experience, if you feel that's going to be important, as well as talk a little bit on what you plan to do. Then it's better always to add a few bullet points discussing your key credentials. Obviously, your studies, the results are important here. Journal publication, that's obviously as a supervisor, I'd be interested to see and get the idea that, okay, somebody is approaching me, they have prepared for a while. It's not like I have to teach them the ABCs of research, but rather this is someone who at least have the beginner level of understanding. Conference proceedings are also very useful here. And given the fact that most of the applicants are coming from places where English is not their first language, IELTS or TOEFL are required. So if your score is decent, that is something also you need to highlight here. And then rather than uploading a lot of documents, attach your CV and the proposal. These are essentially a very decent template on how to sell yourself to potential supervisors at the initial stages. It's not likely that you only need to contact through email. LinkedIn as a social media site is very, very popular among academics as well. So this is also where you can approach, but this would be sort of like a layout of things that you need to contact the potential supervisors with. With regards to the proposal, many expect the initial proposal to be the begin all end all of all their PhD research. That's not the case. You should not be expecting that the initial proposal you're writing is turning up going to be the actual PhD research. I myself, for example, the proposal I wrote, it got totally destroyed and ripped apart within the first meeting, within 10 minutes of the first meeting with my PhD supervisors when I actually started my program. And the general idea is when you write a proposal, it's not for the fact that it's going to be something you are actually going to be able to pursue or will be pursuing, but rather it's about the fact that you understand the basic etiquettes of research, your writing skill, your ability to prove a point in terms of going through literature, the fact that you're demonstrating that it's where you know the literature, you know the key journals, key papers to look out for. As I said, these key etiquettes are something that is demonstrated, and that is what the supervisors would look at when there is a proposal coming in. Now, one important thing, and this is the most important, I would say, is you have to ensure that even though there's a highly likelihood chance that the proposal will not be the same as what it goes through, but it must be something that is properly aligned with the supervisor's research expertise or interest. So I get hit by a lot of potential candidates from time to time, having their interest to pursue something with economics, macroeconomics, or areas that's not exactly my area of expertise. And once I see the email, the first thing I would notice is that, okay, this student obviously haven't studied what I do, and in my opinion also, how can I actually help out the supervisor student, because the student is in a different area than what I am planning to do with. So this is essentially very important. You have to ensure that whatever proposal you're writing, it is in the close area with the supervisor's expertise. This is where you need to spend quality time studying supervisors. Pretty much all the universities have their staff list online, where you can find who are the lecturers, senior lecturers, associate professors in those universities. This is where you need to study their profile, look at what the research interest is, what they've done, what have been the past publications, whether they have any grants available. That would give you the idea that, okay, this supervisor is in this area, and if that is what you wish to pursue your studies on, then okay, they are the suitable professors to begin with. And then you need to study a bit more. You need to study the publication record. That's the key thing. And also, it's always better to target senior people, professors or associate professors, in the sense that a lot of them, they carry a lot of big weights in terms of scholarships and those sort of financial assistance. But then again, if you find someone who's a lecturer or senior lecturer who have good publication record and is interested to supervise students, go ahead, contact with them. If required, they will tag along a senior academic with you. But make sure you study the publication record, see whether they are publishing in your area of expertise or interest. If required, base your proposal around that. So in that way, you know that the supervisor is someone who's actually, if the proposal goes through, then we'll be able to help you out. Also, you have to understand that one size does not fit all. So it's not like, okay, I wrote one proposal on climate finance. This is something I can send to all supervisors. If required, make changes here and there. That is why, again, the whole idea of the long game comes in, because you have to ensure that the supervisors are interested. So different supervisors are going to have different requirements. Some might be good with mixed method research. Some might be good with econometric method research. You need to identify and make changes where you see fit. And one thing that I always encourage, because I myself have seen this happen quite a lot, ensure that you're not emailing multiple academics in the same university simultaneously. That means don't email 3 professors at the same university at the same time, because we all talk with each other, right? So obviously when we see that, okay, the same person is mailing everyone or spamming everyone's email account, we don't take it kindly. It's always better to email someone, maybe send a sort of like secondary email as a refresher email maybe a week later, or at least wait until 2 to 3 weeks before you decide to approach someone else. Don't simultaneously send emails. That's a very, very major red flag for anyone trying to find supervisors, essentially. So when it comes to writing the proposal, as I was constantly focusing on, few key things to look out for. The first thing is obviously the length of the proposal. I see a lot of time people writing huge proposals, 15 pages, 30 pages. I recently came across one which was 35 pages. And that's too long. We don't have, or any potential supervisor don't have the time to go through that long proposal. One thing is obviously the time required to go through that. We are always busy. Most professors are, they don't have that much time to go through that. But another key factor is to look at the fact whether it's something that's authentic, something you are actually coming up with. So if a supervisor sees that somebody is writing a 30-page proposal on some topic, they might think that, okay, this is something they've already started working on, or maybe there's a bit of potential integrity issue. They will not be going through that. In fact, the whole research training that we receive for supervision allows us to focus more on continuous development with the student rather than having student build a proposal all by themselves, like in terms of a big proposal or big research idea. So writing long proposals are not going to be something that actually add value to your work. So that is why I initially always ask students to write proposals, even though I'm saying here not more than 3 to 5 pages, I would say do not go over 6-7 pages, excluding references. This is where it's concise and you know what the proposal is focusing on significant research gaps. So there is no point in writing generic literature review, introducing, if the topic is on how X affects Y, don't write 2 pages on explaining what is X, what is Y. Rather focus more on why studying this relationship between Y and X is actually important, why it makes sense, whether it has been done in some way before, and how they might actually affect each other. That is the key way to proceed rather than just doing a generic literature review for a big number of pages that's not going to add any value. Now, this idea, the fact that you are having a research gap that has significant contribution to the literature, this is a very open-ended idea. A lot of people feel that it's just something we can do, like, okay, there has been a study on climate risk and stock prices. They have done that only for the US perspective. I will just do the same thing for emerging countries or Asian markets. That's a contribution. Not necessarily. That sort of contribution is more marginal than anything. Highly likely those sort of papers are not going to go to top-ranked journals because the top-ranked journals will not see that this is actually an essentially new thing. So unless there is a very big reason why it makes sense to study this particular research question from emerging market perspective, it's not going to add any value. So just retesting existing studies on different samples or just using advanced techniques rather than whatever has been done, that's not sufficient. That is not sufficient for PhD research. That might be publication worthy in Q2, Q3, Q1 ranked journals to some extent, but for a PhD thesis where it's going to be 3 to 4 years of study looking into a topic, that is not enough. So instead, it's about identifying a key construct, a key concept that's new, that's emerging, that's contemporary, and then coming up with 2 to 3 different ideas using that same construct as either, let's say, dependent or independent variable. That's a way to proceed. So for example, there has been in my area of finance and to some extent accounting as well, there is this new focus where now people are doing a lot of textual analysis. So researchers look at all the annual reports and stakeholder conferences like stockholder year-end conferences, the transcript of that, and based on that they do tonal analysis. They look at the different tone of wordings used in key areas such as climate risk, biodiversity risk, or let's say political risk, and then use those constructs as a major independent variable affecting financial decision making or accounting decision making. If you can come up with a new construct, or let's say a construct that's very new, there's not a lot of topic that has come out of it, that could be a key construct. Come up with ways where you use it in 2 to 3 different ideas, let's say from a finance accounting perspective, earnings manipulation, let's say it could be cash holding, this sort of different ideas. That shows that you have a bit of long-term planning. You have found a key idea that's something that's very new, and you're planning to make more things out of it. That shows the long-term planning to a supervisor that, okay, this student is ready for a thesis writing perspective, planning 3 to 4 years of work in advance. So that's a very key way to write a short, concise research proposal that might attract supervisors to the point. Also, it's always better to research the university if possible, because most of the research in accounting, finance, and economics these days use secondary data. For finance and economics, that's a key data source. You need to look at what are the different paid subscriptions they have. So for finance, if it's mostly in the US market, which is a key area for top quality publications, they look at accounting data sources like CompuStat. Now, it's very expensive. Most universities don't have access to that. For example, my university at Flinders, we don't have access to that. So you can get the idea that the university, the professors you're trying to target, whether they have access to it or not. If the university have subscribed to those sort of databases, then it makes sense to write a proposal using constructs that uses those data sets. Now, you might ask, okay, how do I know whether the university has that data or not? You can look at the academic's research profile and past publications. If the academic is using that on the last 4 to 5 publications with the same data sources, you would get the idea that, okay, most likely the university has that data. It's a bit tough. It's not something you would get access straight away, be able to understand. Like, for example, my university don't have CompuStat. So what I do is I work with a lot of researchers, my colleagues, whose university has access. So, and at the end of the day, we collaborate with them. But you get the idea of that in terms of just a bit of idea of what sort of data there is available. And ensure, again, as I said, the proposal is in the supervisor's area of expertise. What they're doing, the area they're focusing on, ensure that your proposal aligns with that area. Another way to catch the eye of a supervisor through a proposal is to show that you know the proper proper outlets to look for good papers. So whenever you are writing a proposal, you have to ensure that you are citing references. It must have a bibliography or a reference, ideally through the use of, let's say, EndNote softwares, or you can do manual referencing or use BibTeX, Mandalay, or other softwares, that's fine. But the fact that you must have key literatures outlined there. You must have some references in the proposal. Try to ensure that whenever you're citing papers based on which literature review you are writing this proposal, they're from top quality journals. It could be in the ABDC Australian Business Deans Council ranking, A star or A, or just focus on Scopus Q1, Q2. There is this way in Google Chrome where you can look at the quality of the journals. Do that, but through Google Scholar you can get this. But ensure that you are citing only top tier papers. A lot of people use papers from journals that are not at that level. And obviously, when we see those proposals using those very spread across papers, we know that, okay, the students haven't reached that level of understanding yet. Try to avoid citing very old papers unless those are very key theoretical citations. Like in corporate finance, we have a lot of citations from the 1970s and 80s. Those are fine. But other than that, avoid citing very old papers. In terms of the structure, I would say, given the fact that you're writing a concise 5 to 7 page maximum proposal, it should have a short introduction, introducing the whole idea of what you're writing a proposal about, a short literature review that leads to identifying the research gap. So as I said, it's not going to be focusing on introducing the X and Y construct of your proposal, but rather looking more into why X and Y might have a relationship, why would anyone be interested on that, and whether it has been studied before or whether there is a research gap on particular outlook of it. You should introduce your key variables and have a proposed research model, which is essentially like an econometric model showing your y's, x's, control variables, and others. And again, reiterate the significance of the study and how it contributes to the existing literature. A lot of the idea on how these different points make sense, you can get ideas through reading top quality papers. So if you are intending to do your research in management, marketing, look at top tier A-star journal articles, you will see they have a structure like this. Obviously, if it's management or marketing, the literature review would be bigger, even in accounting as well, whereas finance and economics, they're more concise. But they would have all these key points. You will see they're reiterating how this paper makes a contribution in areas where there has not been enough contributions done. Use that way of writing. And this is something I always ask everyone to do. Don't just start writing as if it's an course assignment or something like that. Research proposal, research writing is considerably different. And you will get the sense of it once you start reading 30, 40 papers. Without that, you will not know how to write in the proper research lingo. Which is why, in order to stay ahead of the game, my initial reference and suggestion is always to read recent papers, 10 to 15 years if required, in top tier journals. In corporate finance, for example, given that this is one of my key area, look at papers from Journal of Corporate Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, Review of Financial Studies, Journal of Banking and Finance, British Accounting Review, Journal of Finance, all these top ones. In accounting and auditing, again, similar, European Accounting Review, Contemporary Accounting Review, The Accounting Review, British Accounting Review. For management, it could be, let's say, British Management Journal, British Journal of Management. It could be, let's say, Strategic Management Journal. So those are essentially the big ones. If it's international business, it could be Journal of International Business Studies. And obviously, you will get the idea of it if you search in, let's say, ABDC Journal Quality List. If you just search it in Google, you will be able to see discipline-wide. If you say, okay, what are the A-star or A journals, it will come up with the list. So start extensively studying these papers, not just for the sake of getting ideas, but also for the sake of getting the hang of the writing lingo, which is essentially key in the proposal writing as well as future thesis writing. Also, given the more importance that we're seeing in data analysis, ensure that you learn some bits of coding or use of statistical software for analysis. If you are interested in primary data for marketing, management, or accounting with questionnaire surveys or systematic literature review, SPSS, Amos, Smart PLS, NVivo, a lot of other softwares are there. Understand what is required by reading the related papers to get that idea. If you are interested with secondary data, like I am, Stata is essentially a very key thing. You could do the same sort of analysis with SAS, and then for coding and also data sorting, R or Python essential. So it's important that you learn at least two of them. Obviously, YouTube is a very good source for your initial studies. And also with Stata R, there are so many user forums where they provide suggestions to any typical problem the user is facing. You need to spend, as I said, a lot of time, given that it's a long game. You cannot expect that you just apply and evidently within 1 year everything will sort out. It takes time, but this is how you start preparing. Also, to get a bit more sort of like reasonable theoretical idea, look at a lot of empirical paper that comes in management journals. This is applicable for finance and accounting students because this is where a lot of ideas, which in the finance or accounting journals might be a bit more applied use, you will see a bit more theoretical grounding to that in management journals. Also, do not typecast discipline-specific ideas. A lot of times people say that, okay, management journals, they're about management. Why an accounting finance people would look into it? You will see there are a lot of management journals that are a bit more cross-disciplinary. Strategic Management Journal, British Journal of Management. If you read through that, you will get a lot of papers that are looking at accounting finance concepts. Management Science is another journal. And obviously, this is where you get a bit more idea because the management style of writing is a bit more explanatory compared to finance or economics. And with regards to the supervisor search, ensure that you have like a database spreadsheet with all the different supervisors in your areas of expertise try to list at least 2 to 3 academics. Like I used to do that in a bookmark in my browser. It had almost 30 academics listed. An Excel spreadsheet is even more personalized, and that's something you can do to get like a score. Like spend 3 weeks, 2 weeks, just ensuring that you have a database ready, and then start reaching out to the potential supervisors. In terms of the scholarship puzzle, undergraduate CGPA is a very, very key thing, even though a lot of people say that, okay, extracurricular activities, that's important. That's important for corporate sector, perhaps, but when it comes to academics, the CGPA is a key thing. Even if somebody is assessing your application, undergraduate CGPA is one of the first things they look at. So at least try to have for like a CGPA of 3.5 or above, wherever you're studying. If your CGPA is moderate, then having quality publication would be even more important to kind of like compensate for that. As I said, publication is king. I try to have at least 2 to 3 Scopus Q1, Q2 ranked journals before you start applying for good PhD programs. Academic referee profile is good. It's an important factor when you're applying. You need to specify references, academic referees, and the application committee actually reaches out to them. And the referees ideally should be the ones who have good publications and foreign international degrees from reputed universities, because the scholarship committee would consider their opinion to be more sort of like relatable with their university scholarship criteria. And ensure that you are in touch with the referees so that they can submit the reports on your behalf. And as I said, if you start having conversation with the prospective supervisor, keep in touch and convince them. In many cases, some supervisors might ask you to do a bit of preliminary test. Like my supervisor is editor-in-chief in a A-ranked top journal. So what he did was he asked me to review papers, 1 or 2 papers for his journal. That was essentially a test to see how good I am at critiquing people's work. And I took a bit of time, paid very big attention to ensuring that the review report is robust so that the supervisor know that, okay, this student actually has a bit of criticism skill. Or in many cases, they might ask you to do some data-related challenges to see whether you actually learned some required coding or required analysis methods. Make sure that once the supervisor has agreed to supervise, you respond to any queries they have on time. That's critically important. And they are very busy, so always give them some time for them to respond. Don't just expect them to instantly respond whatever you write the emails to. They are very busy, so obviously you need to keep that in mind. In terms of some mistakes to avoid, as I said, when you're approaching supervisors, and this is something that we see all over the world, incorrect writing of the name, spelling, or designation, nobody likes it. And obviously, as a supervisor who's getting that extra time to review your applications or emails, please ensure that you're writing them with the correct spelling or designation. Don't write a professor as lecturer, or don't try to flatter a lecturer by saying he's a professor. Keep it simple, but ensure that you're addressing them correctly. Ensure that your research interest is not misaligned. So for example, I saw recently one accounting student was asking an academic in public policy management, which doesn't make sense. They won't be understanding of the requirements. So always ensure that if you're an accounting student, addressing an accounting or finance professor. And ensure that you have the entry key requirements met. So for example, if you just have an MBA that didn't have any research component, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to start a PhD straight away. So in that case, it would make sense to focus on, let's say, another degree that has the component and meets that eligibility criteria. As I said, don't mail more than one colleague from the same department simultaneously. And also, even though I've shown earlier a basic mail template, don't use the same template all over. Try to make adjustments as you see fit. And when it comes to writing emails or even in your CV, avoid writing unnecessary details. A lot of people write their marital status or religion. Not that important in this case. In Australia, UK, the CVs don't have pictures of the applicants. So even I myself did that because I didn't know it. But as I've seen that happen, write CVs that are in international standard to get a good idea of that. Look at university professors' profile. A lot of them have their CV there. So maybe follow their template. And try not to oversell your own competency. try not to sell something that, okay, you have this area expertise, which you don't, because that will eventually come up and that's not going to end up with a good outcome. And with the proposal, as I said, avoid just working with existing studies and trying to come up with a different sample or different new methodology. That's not a PhD level contribution. As I said, try to write less, concise, to the point, not more than 5 to 7 pages. Don't write too long. Try to include important citations, key papers, and avoid using citations from questionable sources, which is essentially journals that are not ranked in, let's say, Scopus or ABDC. Avoid those sort of citations as references. Also, if you write a literature review, it's supposed to be like a concise version of the papers, journal articles that you see. Sometimes I get literature reviews that has bullet points. Please, that doesn't make sense. That's an indication that you don't know how to write a research paper at the end of the day. So these are the sort of things, obviously, key mistakes you should be looking into avoiding. So that makes the end of my presentation. I think I made it on time, and I hopefully have been able to add some value to your understanding, and that I believe would help you with the PhD admission process. Obviously, I am available in LinkedIn, on emails. If there are any ways I could help out, I'd be more than happy to help out. And again, I'd like to thank you all for coming in. I think this is a good time for any question answer session that you might have any questions.